Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first official episode. The last episode was just a little bit of an introduction. This episode, I want to dive right into it. And one of the approaches that I may have mentioned in the first episode that we will be taking is how philosophy and narrative are really intertwined. Someone's personal philosophy, even a more formal philosophy, is really a narrative. It's a narrative structure that the individual or the philosopher is using to try to make sense of the world. And so we will be talking about both literature and philosophy because you can't really talk about one without the other, as far as I'm concerned. I know they're taught as different disciplines, but there's too many overlaps for them to actually stay separated. This is one of the downsides of the modern academic world is that they have put everything into its own little cubicle, and then you lose a lot of how these things actually interact with each other in the real world. For example, philosophers read literary writers read philosophers. These were never 100% separated as they are in the modern academic world. But I want to start to the beginnings of both philosophy and literature. And one of the things that I want to do is talk about the oral traditions. And then we'll move forward from there into the modern traditions. But we're going to start with the oral traditions. Oral traditions predate writing in every single culture. Every culture on the planet that existed had songs and poetry long before they had writing. And the reason for this is they needed a way to codify their information. They needed a way to codify their culture, their social hierarchies, their philosophies, their laws, their bloodlines, their ethics, even their dietary restrictions and prohibitions. All of these things are conveyed through oral literature. Um, why poetry and songs? Think about it from a logical point of view. Which is easier to do, to memorize a poem or a song or to memorize a novel? And poetry, there were poems that were book length. The Iliad and the Odyssey were book length poems, and they were in the oral tradition long before the Greeks had writing. The Epic of Gilgamesh came down to us in writing, but we know that it would have existed in oral tradition for hundreds or maybe even thousands of years before that culture developed writing. Same thing with Beowulf. Things like Beowulf were originally oral poems. The person would have to memorize the entire thing and then recite it from memory. It wasn't until Christian monks started putting these things down in writing that it became a written story. And so, with everything starting in oral tradition, you have to kind of wonder, well, why is this so important? Well, it's important that a tribe or a culture have a similar narrative so that people are viewing the world in the same way. One of the things that poetry, these stories of the gods and goddesses and kings and queens, one of the things that this does is this codifies the social hierarchy. You can see this in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, you have Gilgamesh, who they tell you right from the beginning is two-thirds divine. He's two-thirds a god and one-third human. And this is to establish his power and the power of his bloodline, because anybody coming up against them would be coming up against someone who was not all human, someone who had some of the divine in their bloodline. And not only does the story mention this, but it gets reinforced through the story itself. So at the beginning of Gilgamesh, he's a very cruel leader. He takes whatever woman he wants. Says no daughter is safe. No son is safe. He picks fights and kills whoever he feels like with the men, and takes as a lover whoever he feels like with the women. And the gods wanted to civilize him a little bit. So they create a friend for him, Enkidu. Enkidu is kind of a civilizing factor. One of the things that happens with, you know, people meeting peers, people that are, approximately their equals, is they can't now just have everything their own way. So Gilgamesh and Enkidu get into a fight. They pretty much are pretty equally matched and they become friends. And this causes him to become a little more civilized and to start thinking about his proper place in the hierarchy. But he begins to go beyond this because one of the things that he does is he and Enkidu kill the bull of heaven, which was one of the creatures of the gods. And so to be punished, they make him, they make his friend Enkidu die. They kind of teach him that, since you've messed with the gods, since you've stepped out of the proper place, you are going to be punished and lose your friend. And this brings Gilgamesh to the realization that he too is also mortal. And so he sets off on a quest trying to find immortality. In the end, he fails in this quest. Um, but story after story, if you look at these oral traditions, you will have a king coming up against a god or a demigod or goddess, and because they've stepped outside of their station, they will be punished. And this is a way of keeping social order. This is a sort of an early political philosophy. Prior to things like this, whoever happened to be the strongest at the moment would be the one that would be in charge. And so if you constantly have everybody fighting to see who is the strongest, you can't really have much advancement in society. You can't have much stability. To have advancement, you have to have somewhat stability. If everybody's trying to be the king or the chieftain or whatever, you are in a state of constant war. So, one of the things that these early tales tried to do was establish the proper hierarchies so that everybody wasn't fighting to be king. So that people would say, okay, this is the way that things are supposed to be according to the gods or God. And so who are we to challenge these things? So you have the beginnings of the establishment of order. And remember, all of this is pre-writing. You can't even have writing until you have a civilization that starts to settle down and make advancements. So this oral tradition goes back to when humans were hunter-gatherers, way before they were even, thinking about farming or building cities when they were wandering. You needed things to keep the tribe together. You needed to give them a common religion. You needed to give them common cultures. You needed something to sort of you put into these stories what were the laws, and you have people that would break the laws and therefore be punished for breaking the laws. So, philosophy, ethics, all of these things were in oral traditions. Now, when you get to societies that become a little more stable, they start to write things down and you start to have written traditions. But the narrative never goes away. There's still a lot of storytelling and narrative building behind all of these philosophies. If you look at even Plato's Republic and then the dialogues of Plato, these are built on narratives. These are people having conversations. These are people talking out the way things should be. And you move into Aristotle, and it's the same. Aristotle is also setting up these narratives. His narratives are a little less story and a little more scientific, but it's still giving a narrative framework where everyone can put how they view the world. And if you think about personal philosophies, your personal narrative foundation, it's the same way. Whenever something happens, you have to be able to make sense of it. And so you start trying to put this into your personal, fit it into your personal narrative. Otherwise, it's impossible to make sense of. So you have this basic worldview, this basic world narrative, and everything that happens has to fit into it. And when things happen that don't fit into a person or a group's narrative, This is where you have sort of a huge crisis where that group or individual just doesn't know what to do with what's going on. They shut down, they become defeated. Eventually, they will alter their personal narrative, alter their social narrative, deal with the new information, and move in a different direction. But this all has to be brought into the fold before they can figure it out. Everything we do, we see through the lens of a narrative, through the lens of a story. If you look at your life, you think about your own life, you view your life as a story. Well, this happened, and then this happened, and I did this, and this happened to me, and I did that, and this happened. And so you try to view it as a coherent, consistent narrative. Now, the problem is, it isn't always a coherent, consistent narrative. As humans, we tend to see things that aren't there. We look for patterns. And if patterns aren't always there, sometimes we see them anyways. Think about when you look at the clouds and you see an animal or a face or something like that. We're hardwired to see patterns, especially faces, but also patterns. If we didn't see things as cause and effect, we didn't see things as patterns, as following a narrative, we couldn't learn, we couldn't develop technology. Even basic, lower animals have a sense of cause and effect. If a dog sticks his nose against something hot and gets burned, he puts up, oh, cause and effect. I touch this to that, it hurts. Don't do that. We have it a little more complicated, actually a lot more complicated. We build it into stories. And if you look at the old literatures, people were, and the old philosophies, people were trying to figure out the same way modern people are, where did things come from? Why did they happen the way they do? What will happen if I, do this? And the more successful narratives were the ones that did a better job of helping people navigate life. The least successful narratives, the ones that went away, were the ones that didn't do a very good job of explaining the world around us. And so we have always built things on narratives. And again, this is true of every culture. You look at the indigenous cultures in the Americas, you look at, early European cultures, Asian cultures, African cultures. It doesn't matter. They were all built on narrative stories and poems that told them how to behave and answered questions like, where do we go when we die? Do we go anywhere? What is the reward for being a good person? What are the things you have to do to be a good person? What is the punishment for being a bad person? And what are the things that make you a bad person? And the reason I say that this translates into the modern world is, if you think about modern culture, it's the same way. Most people's philosophies were not well thought out by them. They didn't sit down in official philosophy classes and learn their ethics and their religion and their, way of being and their political ideas. This stuff all comes to you through narratives. It comes to you through culture. Your parents, your friends, your peers at school, your education, your religion, these things all shape what becomes your personal philosophy or your personal narrative. And we are bombarded in the modern world with a diverse amount of narratives that are thrown at us. In the earlier times where, with Beowulf was written and Gilgamesh and things like that, there were fewer contradictory narratives going on. Most narratives pretty much ran along the same society. As we became more mobile, started bumping into more cultures, we started running into different narratives, and this shapes things. A lot of Christianity came from uh, the influences of Europe, of European religions that existed. You think about the Christmas tree. This is from the old, pagan traditions of Europe, is where this comes from. The fact of Christmas being on, December 25th comes from, the pagan solstice. This is the, time when you have a rebirth of the literal sun. We have it as the birth of the son of Jesus, or the Son of God in the case of Christianity, and the pagans had it the literal rebirth of the sun itself. This is when the days start to get longer again, when life starts to come back to the land. Things like Easter, you see the rabbits and the eggs, and then you don't find them in the Bible. Well, why are these part of, Christian traditions? They're part of the traditions because they're fertility symbols. Easter takes place in the springtime, and so you had this narrative of, the coming back to life of the land, the breeding of animals, the sowing of crops, all of these things about fertility and life coming back. And these are narratives that were there and they were deeply ingrained. And when a new religion or a new idea takes over, it generally doesn't just wipe out all of what came before, because that would make it almost impossible for it to take hold in the general population. So, what you have to do is give them similar narratives, but frame them in a different way. And this reframing of the narrative is how new ideas take over and new traditions are started, but they're still based on older things. So these narratives are much more deeply ingrained than what people realize. Now, in the modern world, we're bombarded with so many narratives. In pre-technology, pre-electronic technology times, I should say, you mainly might bump into contact with one or two other cultures that were close to you, and most people might not even bump into that if they were, sort of in the interior and not in a very big town that had a lot of trade. They may never meet people who think differently than they do. So everyone they meet thinks the same. And so their philosophy was a little more solid, and it was based in one culture. When you get into the world of electronic media where we are today, and you have a wider distribution of literacy and books, you have television, you have movies, you have music, you have social media. Believe it or not, all of these things are ways of shaping narrative. And this is one of the reasons that when dictators take over, when authoritarians take over, the first thing they try to do is silence any narrative that disagrees with the narrative that they have. They will ban poets, they will ban musicians, they will ban movies, ban books, because those things provide a narrative that contradicts what they want the people to accept. And this is also a reason, since technology and since communication is so widespread, that it's become difficult for empires and tyrants to keep power as long as they did in earlier times. If you look at, the empires, they steadily got shorter, each empire. The Greeks lasted a long time. The Romans lasted even longer. But then you get the Spanish Empire, which doesn't last anywhere near as long. You get the British Empire, which doesn't last as long. You had the Soviet Empire, didn't last as long. The American Empire, already heading out the door. And this is because there is a loss of control of one person or one small group being able to control the narrative. So these things, while people think of it as, oh, this is just, entertainment, they're giving you a lot of your philosophy. They're giving you a lot of your culture. A lot of the way you view the world comes from this. For example, you can take the most fluff piece of pop fiction, pop TV show. Um, it's still going to give you things that are reinforced over and over again in your head. What kinds of characters get rewarded? What kinds of characters get punished? What kinds of, characters do the audience cheer when this person is successful? And what kinds of characters do the audience cheer when this person is unsuccessful? These things, believe it or not, are a big factor in shaping philosophy. And they're also a big factor in why authoritarians want to control these narratives. They don't want people seeing different things, weighing different, ideas, and then actually having to measure, well, this one makes sense here and here, this one makes sense here and here, and kind of then coming up with something on their own. They would prefer it if you just believed what you were told, if you just did what they said for you to do. And so as we go through these different episodes, we're going to be looking at everything through this lens of narrative and philosophy because they're intertwined. We're going to talk about different philosophers and different writers from all different time periods, and we're going to talk about how do some of these ideas compare to some of the ideas that are still popular today, and how many of these ideas have gone away. We're also going to talk about things how narratives vary sharply between generations. And this is something that is, instead of slowing down, you'd think it would slow down since we have mass media. We have people all over the world that have potentially the ability to watch the same shows. They don't. And so you have this, ever widening change in the narratives, not only between generations, but within generations. For example, in current time period, if you enjoy anime, you can watch anime and look at anime sites 20 hours a day. If you're into sports, you can watch sports 24 hours a day. If you're into, romance, you can watch romantic movies. If you're into horror, you can watch horror movies, or science fiction, or comic book, or, musicals, or whatever it is you're interested in. We've come to a place where there are so many narratives that are so accessible that we are having a little bit of difficulty, one, seeing them as this is a narrative and there are other narratives, and two, being able to make connections with people who have different narratives. So one of the things we'll also be doing in these episodes is kind of not only looking at one narrative and how it compares to now, but comparing it to other narratives from the time period, other cultures in the time period. Because unless you look at the bigger picture, you're not really understanding what's going on. You're getting a very, you're getting a very one-sided view, and you're getting a view that doesn't really make sense when you think about it, because you're left with wondering, well, why did this happen? And why did that happen? Well, if you're only looking at part of the story, then it won't make sense. For example, if you study what's mainstream American history, you're going to study mainly the history of, not only white people, but predominantly the wealthy white people, the people in business, the people in power. That's what the history is going to cover. If you look at, Black history, you're going to see a very different history. If you look at the history of indigenous peoples, you're going to see another history there, or a history of all the various different groups of immigrants. And each of those histories are going to vary depending on, what time period you're talking about. Are they first generation, second generation, third generation? Did they come in? Which wave of immigration did they come through? All of these make for very full narratives and very misleading narratives if you only study one. If you don't step back a little bit and look at the whole picture, you don't really have a good idea of why things happen. For example, people that'll look at the 1950s and think, oh, the 1950s was perfect. There was no marriage, or there was no divorce, there was no child abuse, there was no spouse abuse, there was no drug usage. None of these things happened. And where did they get those ideas? Well, because they watched the mainstream television shows and the mainstream books from the time period, and those things did not talk about those other things. Those other parts of history that were going on. How things were for the poor people, how things were for different ethnic and racial groups. And so the 60s has this explosion, and people that don't understand other histories other than the mainstream one get very misguided ideas about why the 60s happened the way they did. Why was everyone suddenly so angry in the 60s? The 50s were perfect. I've seen the TV shows, they looked perfect. They weren't perfect. These were time periods where, one, in the 50s, they were trying to sell things. And this is part of what you have to look at when you're looking at the narrative of a time period. Why did it look like they were all perfect families and everyone was happy? Well, they're trying to stimulate the economy after World War II. Most of the world was bombed into rubble. Why was this such a good time period for people in the United States? And people say, well, it's because, people in the United States were better. We were the chosen people, which is a narrative that goes through just about every group. Um, but that is a very big oversimplification of why things were good. There were a lot of factors of why things improved and why they didn't improve for other groups. There was still segregation. Child abuse and spouse abuse were still legal as long as you didn't murder your child or your spouse. These are things that were just allowed. Women weren't allowed to own property. And people say, well, yeah, that's what made it, good. That's what made it prosperous. No, what made it prosperous was we came out of World War II and the rest of the world was bombed into rubble. If you look at the condition of the Japanese, the European industries, and things like that, they were in ruins because of all the bombing and the fighting of World War II. With the wars going on there, you also had much larger losses of life. Americans lost a lot of soldiers in World War II, but nothing like the people in Europe and Asia lost, because these wars weren't happening somewhere else with just soldiers. These wars were happening in towns, in villages, in cities. And so, you had civilians dying as well. You had infrastructure being bombed in these places. The United States never really got bombed except for Pearl Harbor. So we still had our factories, our bridges, our roads, all of these things. So there are so many different things that go into it, and this is why when in this these episodes, when we talk about narrative, we're going to look at it from a lot of different perspectives, not just the one that most people are used to. Because when you do that, you don't really get a good sense of why things are the way they are, why they were the way they were. You really have to factor in all of the differences and see the competing narratives, and realize that sometimes when you look back at the past and you think this is the way it was, you have to realize that history was written mainly by the people who won, and so a lot of other narratives were completely wiped out. In Europe, we know very little about the religious practices of Europeans pre-Christianity, except for the Roman Empire. But what were the Germanic tribes, the Scandinavian tribes, the Celtic tribes? What were their religions like? We have bits and pieces of them, but most of them that survive from either the Greeks or the Romans talking about them, or the later Christian monks writing about these traditions when they were Christianizing the area. So as we go through these episodes, they're going to be a lot more complicated than probably what you're used to. And you're going to see some of the things that you're going to recognize, and you're going to see other things, and sort of have to realize that this is all part of the narrative. And even this one podcast is not going to give you the whole story. No one person can give you the whole story. What I'm doing here is giving you more information, more angles to look at things. And then you need to look at these things, compare them to the things you've seen, the things you know, and then go out and find other people who are speaking or writing about these things and see what other perspectives they can add to it. One of the things that I've always found exciting and interesting about learning was that the more that you learn, the more you realize there's way more to learn. And you don't get to that point where, okay, I got all of it, I know everything, I can quit. And now this is boring. It's like a game that never ends. It's a game that you can keep playing and keep growing and keep going forever, because there is no limit to the things that you can learn, except what you're limited by, how much you actually look, and limited by your lifespan itself. So it's something that you can, if you look at it with, you know, enthusiasm and excitement, you can see this as something you can keep learning, keep growing, keep finding out more. If you're just looking for quick answers, you're probably not going to enjoy a lot of this podcast because it is going to challenge you to look. It is going to challenge you to think. I'm not, here to give you all the answers. I'm here to, bring a few things, as many as I can, and say, okay, go out into the world and find even more. Okay, I'm going to break off this episode here. I hope all of you are doing well and staying safe, and I will talk to you again very soon.